On the Kola Peninsula, in the far northwest of the Russian Federation, near the Norwegian border, sits a small concrete cap on the ground. Underneath it is a borehole 12,262 meters deep, the deepest artificial point on or below the surface of the Earth. The Soviet Union spent 24 years drilling it. The hole has not been surpassed since the project ended in 1992. The site itself was sealed in 2008. In the 1960s, the Soviet Council of Ministers authorized an Earth science program intended to do, on continental crust, what the International Borehole program had attempted earlier on oceanic crust, to drill into the deep crust to recover physical samples and to test geophysical models that, until that point, depended entirely on indirect inferences from earthquake seismology. The continental analog was scientifically more interesting in some respects. The continental crust is older, thicker, more chemically varied, and the seismic transitions inside it, particularly the Conrad discontinuity, the boundary between the upper and lower crust at roughly 10 to 15 kilometers depth in many regions, were unexplained. Some models held that the discontinuity was a major chemical change. Others held that it was a phase transition. Direct rock samples would settle the question. The Kola Peninsula was chosen because the surface geology there exposed some of the oldest rocks on Earth, Archean granites, 2.5 to 3 billion years old, meaning that drilling into the basement would access crust that had been chemically and tectonically stable for an extremely long time. The site was at Zapolyani, north of the Arctic Circle. Drilling began on the 24th of May, 1970. The technical challenge was severe. Standard rotary drilling, a rigid drill string rotated from the surface, does not scale to extreme depth. The string becomes too heavy. The friction between string and borehole wall absorbs all the rotational torque, and the bit at the bottom stops turning. The Soviet team designed a different system. The drill string was rigid only at the top. The cutting head at the bottom was driven by a hydraulic-powered turbine, fed by drilling mud pumped down through the string. The string itself only had to deliver fluid and recover cuttings. The mud system was a continuing problem. At depths past about 7 kilometers, the rock temperature began rising faster than the project's models had predicted. The drilling mud lost viscosity. The instruments at depth degraded. Bits broke. Each broken bit required pulling the entire 8 or more kilometers of string back to the surface, recovering the broken piece, and rerunning. A single round trip took around 2 days. By June 1979, the borehole had reached 9,583 meters, already the deepest in history. Drilling continued. By 1983, depth had reached 12,000 meters. By 1990, the deepest of the project's several boreholes, the SG3 borehole, had reached 12,262 meters. That number was not subsequently exceeded. The Conrad discontinuity, which was the original geophysical target of the project, did not exist at the Kola location in the form predicted. The seismic boundary that earthquakes had appeared to identify as a chemical change between upper and lower crust turned out, on direct sampling, to be a transition zone of severely fractured rock saturated with hot mineralized water. Many subsequent published reanalyses of seismic data from other continental sites have argued that the same effect, fluid-filled fracture zones interpreted as chemical boundaries, likely accounts for similar discontinuities elsewhere. This was a major working result. Below approximately 7 kilometers, the temperature was significantly higher than the pre-drilling thermal model had predicted, about 180 degrees centigrade at 12 kilometers, where the model had predicted around 100. The geothermal gradient on the Kola Peninsula was steeper than the regional models had suggested. Microbial DNA was recovered, in a subset of the deepest cores, in fluid samples from fractures. The findings, published primarily by the Russian geologist Alexander Kremenetsky and collaborators in the 1980s and 1990s, were among the early data points that established the existence of the deep biosphere, bacterial life surviving at depths previously thought sterile. Free hydrogen and helium gas were recovered at depths and concentrations not predicted by surface measurements, suggesting active deep crustal chemical processes that older crustal models had not included. In 1989, an evangelical Christian radio broadcaster in Texas began circulating an audio recording purportedly made at the bottom of the Kola Superdeep borehole. The recording featured screaming and what the broadcaster identified as the sounds of damned souls. The audio was a fabrication. The original sound was traced several years later to a re-edited segment of the soundtrack to the 1972 Italian horror film Barren Blood, directed by Mario Bava, slowed down and looped. The Soviet drilling project recorded no such sounds. The borehole instruments at depth were geophysical temperature probes, density measurements, fluid samplers, magnetometers, not microphones. There is no acoustic record of any kind from the bottom of the SG3 borehole. The hoax circulated in Christian broadcast circles in the early 1990s as a literal recording of hell. It is occasionally still cited online. The published Soviet and post-Soviet scientific record for the project, extensive, contains nothing remotely like it. Drilling at SG3 was suspended in 1992. The reasons were a combination of technical and economic. Technically, the rock temperature at the projected next phase, beyond roughly 13 kilometers, was high enough that the drilling fluid then in use could no longer maintain its physical properties. New drilling fluid chemistry would have been required. Several research papers from the early 1990s laid out what would have been needed. Economically, the dissolution of the Soviet Union in late 1991 ended the federal funding stream that had supported the project. The reorganized Russian Federation, working through severe economic strain in the 1990s, did not restore the funding. The site continued to operate at a reduced level for scientific monitoring through the 1990s and into the 2000s. In 2008, it was officially closed. The borehole was capped. The above-ground research facility, including the rig and the laboratory buildings, was largely dismantled and the metal was sold for scrap. Photographs of the abandoned site, taken in the 2010s, show a small concrete cap on the ground surrounded by foundations. The Kola Superdeep borehole is, as of writing, still the deepest artificial point on or below the surface of the Earth. The two later projects that approached it, the German continental drilling program KTB at Windischeschenbach, completed at 9,101 meters in 1994, and the offshore Chavo well drilled by ExxonNeftegas off Sakhalin Island, completed at 12,345 meters of measured depth in 2011, are in different categories. KTB was scientifically planned but reached a shallower depth. Chavo is technically deeper as a measured drilling string distance, but it is a directional well drilled at a heavy slant from a coastal platform. Its true vertical depth below the surface is about 2.5 kilometers. As a vertical hole, the metric the Kola project optimized for 12,262 meters has not been surpassed. Several published reviews, most notably the 2014 retrospective by Kozlovsky and the International Working Group, argue that the project, although ended on funding, achieved most of its original geophysical objectives and produced findings that have shaped continental crust models for 35 years. A Soviet geophysics program proposed in the 1960s started on the 24th of May 1970 and continued for 24 years, drilled the deepest hole humans have made into the planet they live on. The hole stopped at 12,262 meters. The bottom of the hole sits in granite at 180 degrees centigrade. There are bacteria in fractures down there. There is no sound recording. The cap is still there, on the Kola Peninsula, north of the Arctic Circle, near the Norwegian border. The Earth is, on average, 6,371 kilometers from surface to center. We have reached 0.19% of the way down.